The sterile corridors of the Vortak Military Academy hummed with the efficiency of a 1,000-year-old institution. Chrome walls reflected the morning light from Vortak Prime's twin suns, casting geometric patterns across the polished floors where cadets moved in perfect formation to their assigned analysis chambers. Cadet Zyxthala slithered through the entrance of Analysis Bay 7, her serpentine lower body coiling with practiced grace as she settled before the primary holographic terminal. Her scales, a brilliant emerald that darkened to obsidian at the edges, caught the blue-white glow of the awakening display. At 23 cycles old, she was among the Academy's most promising tactical analysts, bred from a line of distinguished military commanders who had shaped the Vortak Empire's expansion across the galaxy. The assignment parameters materialized in the air before her elongated snout. Strategic analysis of Species 7 Alpha, humans, military capabilities assessment, classification, routine evaluation priority, low expected completion, 2.5 standard hours. Zyxthala's golden eyes, evolved over millennia for tracking prey across the crystalline hunting grounds of her homeworld, narrowed in barely concealed disdain. Her forked tongue flicked out, tasting the recycled air of the chamber as she processed the mundane nature of her assignment. Another primitive species from the Rim territories, she muttered, her voice carrying the refined accent of Vortak nobility. Her study partner, Cadet Quindar of the Zenthari Collective, rippled with bioluminescent amusement. His translucent blue form shifted in the adjacent bay, tentacles dancing across his own holographic interface. The outer systems do produce the most entertaining subjects for study, Quindar replied, his voice melodious despite being artificially generated through vocal implants. His species had evolved beyond vocal cords millennia ago, communicating through complex patterns of light that painted stories across their crystalline skin. Though I confess curiosity about why the High Command bothers with such detailed analysis of obviously inferior civilizations. Zyxthala's head swayed in agreement, a gesture that would have been hypnotic to human eyes. The question held genuine puzzlement. The Vortak military machine was perfection incarnate, 17 star systems conquered in the past century alone, each campaign a masterwork of strategic brilliance. Their doctrine emphasized overwhelming force applied with surgical precision, conflicts resolved in days rather than cycles, civilian casualties minimized through superior targeting algorithms and orbital bombardment protocols. The Academy's achievement galleries stretched along the corridor outside, holographic monuments to Vortak superiority. The siege of Kethmoran lasting exactly 47 hours and 23 minutes, the pacification of the Drex Nebula completed in 6.2 standard days, the integration of the Mollusk Confederacy achieved with a remarkable 99.7% efficiency rating and minimal resource expenditure. Perhaps, Zyxthala mused, accessing the preliminary data files, these humans have developed some unexpected technological advancement. Anti-gravity weaponry? Temporal displacement fields. She paused, reading the technical specifications. No. They've barely achieved rudimentary faster-than-light capability, still using chemical propulsion for atmospheric operations. Their most sophisticated weapons appear to be crude fusion devices that contaminate vast areas of their own habitat when deployed. She activated the first data packet with casual confidence, settling into her analysis coil. Her tail, nearly 3 meters of powerful muscle, wrapped beneath her torso as she prepared for what should be a routine cataloging of another primitive military structure. The standard pattern. Basic metallurgy, tribal warfare evolving into organized conflict, resource competition, perhaps some interesting biological adaptations worth noting for future conquest planning. Earth's military history began to unfold, starting with something the humans termed World War I. Zyxthala expected to complete her analysis within the hour, file a standard report, and move on to more challenging coursework. She was about to discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption would prove. The first holographic projections flickered to life with startling clarity, and Zyxthala found herself virtually standing in what humans had designated the Western Front. The sensory data was overwhelming, the acrid stench of cordite and decay, the constant thunder of artillery that made her scales vibrate in sympathetic resonance. the bone-deep cold of a European winter that her homeworld's climate control systems could never replicate. But it was the sight that made her recoil in genuine shock. Stretching beyond the horizon, carved into the earth like infected wounds, were trenches. Millions of humans huddled in these mud-filled channels, separated from their enemies by mere hundreds of meters of cratered wasteland they had named No Man's Land. "This is aberrant," she whispered, her analytical mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. The holographic timeline indicated this stalemate had persisted for 4 years. For years. By Vorthack standards, any military engagement that lasted more than a standard week was considered a catastrophic failure of command. Her golden eyes tracked the movement of human soldiers as they prepared for what their commanders called going over the top. Wave after wave of them, climbing from their trenches into the teeth of machine gun fire. The mathematical certainty of their deaths was absolute, the defensive positions were impregnable, the killing fields perfectly established. Any rational military mind would have declared the offensive impossible and sought alternative strategies. Yet they kept coming. "Quindar," she called to her study partner, her voice tight with confusion. Analysis of casualty projections versus tactical objectives achieved. The Zenthari's bioluminescent patterns pulsed as he processed the data. First day of the Somme offensive, 60,000 human casualties for territorial gains of less than 2 kilometers in most sectors. Complete tactical failure by any rational metric. Zwaxthala's serpentine form coiled tighter as she watched a group of human medics crawling through the hellscape under active enemy fire. They were retrieving wounded soldiers, combat ineffective personnel who, by all logical military doctrine, should be written off as acceptable losses. The medics exposed themselves to certain death for soldiers who would never fight again. Computer, display standard Vorthack protocol for battlefield casualties. Vorthack Military Doctrine 7.3. Combat ineffective personnel beyond immediate extraction range are to be administered honorable termination to prevent capture and intelligence compromise. Mission parameters take precedence over individual preservation. Clean, efficient, logical. So why did watching these humans drag their wounded to safety through mud and blood make something deep in her chest cavity constrict painfully? She focused on a particular segment, a human private named Morrison carrying his wounded sergeant 3 kilometers through enemy territory. The sergeant had lost both legs to a shell burst and would never walk again, much less fight. Morrison could have moved twice as fast alone, could have saved himself and carried vital intelligence back to command. Instead, he struggled through craters and wire, stopping to shield his sergeant's body with his own when artillery fell close. "The tactical value is 0, Zwaxthala murmured, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Negative, even." Morrison's survival probability decreased by 73% due to the additional burden. Yet Morrison made it. Both of them made it. The hologram shifted to another scene, human soldiers sharing their rations with enemy prisoners, despite their own supply shortages. Vorthack doctrine was explicit. Enemy combatants received minimum sustenance required to prevent immediate death. Resources were allocated by strategic priority, not emotional impulse. But here were humans, hungry themselves, feeding their captives first. "Perhaps," Quindar observed, his tentacles flickering with uncertainty, "their command structure lacks proper disciplinary protocols. Emotional decision-making typically indicates insufficient training." Zwaxthala wanted to agree, but the data contradicted that assessment. These humans weren't undisciplined. They followed orders with remarkable consistency. They weren't untrained. Their tactical adaptations showed sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics. They weren't cowardly. Their courage bordered on the incomprehensible. They were something else entirely. Something the Vorthack military academic had no classification for. The holographic timeline advanced, showing 4 years of this madness. Millions dead. Empires bankrupted. Entire generations sacrificed in the mud. Any reasonable species would have negotiated a ceasefire after the first few battles proved the impossibility of decisive victory. The humans fought until their enemies collapsed from exhaustion. "Computer," Zwaxthala said quietly, Display total casualties for this conflict. Estimated casualties: 17 million dead, 20 million wounded. For comparison, the entire Vortak military comprised 2.3 million active personnel across 17 conquered systems. These humans had lost 8 times that number in a single planetary conflict and called it their First World War, implying there had been others. ZYX-Thala's scales rippled with an emotion she couldn't identify as the next data packet loaded automatically. The holographic display showed a date that made her stomach acids churn. 1939 to 1945. The Second World War. The holographic projection shifted, and ZYX-Thala found herself witnessing something that defied every principle of rational warfare. The scale of World War II hit her consciousness like a plasma bombardment, each statistic more incomprehensible than the last. 60 million dead, she breathed, her serpentine form recoiling from the display. Computer, verify this data. Data verified. Human casualties for Second World War. 60 million killed, additional 75 million wounded or displaced. Conflict duration: 6 years, 1 day. Quindar's bioluminescent patterns flickered in what could only be described as systemic shock. The entire population of my homeworld is 42 million. These humans lost more beings in one conflict than my species has ever produced. But the numbers were just the beginning. ZYX-Thala watched in growing horror as the hologram displayed systematic genocide. Entire populations murdered with industrial efficiency that would have impressed Vortak logistics officers, if not for the complete absence of military purpose. Cities reduced to ash by weapons that turned night into day. Children vaporized in microseconds. Barbaric, she declared, but her voice carried no conviction, because embedded within this barbarity was something that made her scales crawl with an emotion she couldn't name. The Battle of Britain materialized before them, human pilots climbing into aircraft they knew were technological inferiors, facing an enemy that outnumbered them 5 to 1. Vortak combat doctrine was explicit. Avoid engagement when facing odds greater than 2:1 unless mission-critical objectives demanded sacrifice. These humans faced 5:1 odds every day for months. Computer, display pilot survival statistics for Royal Air Force during Battle of Britain. Average pilot life expectancy: 87 flight hours. Replacement rate: 120% monthly. ZYX-Thala's golden eyes tracked a young human pilot, barely past adolescence by his species standards, walking toward his fighter for the 4th time that day. His hands shook with exhaustion. His eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had watched too many friends die. Yet he climbed into that cockpit knowing the mathematical certainty of his eventual death. "Why?" she whispered to the hologram. "Your command knows you cannot win. Your pilots know they cannot survive. Why continue?" But even as she asked, she watched Squadron Leader Park address his pilots. "Gentlemen, we are all that stands between invasion and our homes. If we fail, Britain falls." The human pilot nodded, started his engine, and took off to die for people he would never meet. ZYX-Thala's analytical mind reeled as the projection shifted to the Pacific Theater. Naval battles that raged across distances spanning multiple star systems, fought with vessels that couldn't even achieve orbital velocity. The Japanese kamikaze attacks defied every rational military principle, pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into enemy ships, trading their lives for minimal tactical advantage. "Suicide tactics," Quindar observed. "Desperation born of inevitable defeat." But the data contradicted that assessment. These weren't desperate last stands, they were calculated strategies. Human military planners had weaponized their own people's willingness to die, turning individual sacrifice into strategic doctrine. The D-Day landings unfolded next, and ZYX-Thala felt something fundamental crack inside her worldview. Allied commanders had planned the largest amphibious assault in human history, knowing tens of thousands would die in the first hour. The casualty projections were calculated, accepted, planned for. Yet there they were, storming beaches turned into killing fields, climbing over their fallen comrades to advance mere meters against prepared positions. No orbital bombardment to soften targets. No overwhelming technological superiority. Just humans in boats, crossing open water into the teeth of machine guns and artillery. Computer, calculate probability of mission success for Operation Overlord using Vorthack tactical assessment protocols. Mission success probability, 12.7%. Recommended action. Abort operation, seek alternative strategic approach. The humans had calculated similar odds. They launched the invasion anyway. Zuextala watched a medic on Omaha Beach, crawling through surf turned red with blood to treat wounded soldiers while enemy fire chewed the sand around him. The medic's own chances of survival were negligible. The soldiers he treated would likely die regardless. Yet he kept moving from casualty to casualty until a sniper's bullet finally found him. In that moment, watching the medic's hand reach out toward one more wounded soldier before falling still, Zuextala realized she was witnessing something the Vorthack had bred out of themselves millennia ago. These humans fought not just for victory, but for each other. Computer, she said quietly, display Vorthack casualty figures for the conquest of Kepler 442. Vorthack casualties, 1,247 dead, 3,891 wounded. Mission duration, 4.2 days. Enemy casualties, 2.1 million. Clean, efficient, overwhelming. And suddenly, she wasn't sure which species was truly civilized. The holographic display shifted again, and Zuextala found herself transported to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. The year was 1968, and she was witnessing something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of warfare itself. Vietnam materialized around her in all its humid, suffocating horror, a conflict that seemed to exist in defiance of every military principle she had ever learned. The sensory inputs were overwhelming. Triple canopy jungle where visibility extended mere meters, oppressive heat that would have killed most Vorthack within hours, and an enemy that materialized from nowhere only to vanish like smoke. Her analytical mind immediately identified the tactical impossibility. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, in terrain that negates every technological advantage? The Vorthack solution would be simple, she murmured to Quindar, watching American soldiers move through vegetation so thick it seemed alive. Orbital bombardment. Defoliate the entire continent, eliminate all cover, achieve total visual dominance. But humans, she was learning, did not think like Vorthack. Instead, she watched young soldiers, many barely past their species' age of majority, walking through a green hell where every tree might conceal death, every path might be mined, every village might harbor enemies indistinguishable from civilians. The psychological strain was visible in their faces, the constant tension of knowing that survival depended on split-second decisions made with incomplete information. And yet they kept walking. A particular segment made her pause the recording, her serpentine form coiling tight with confusion. A human medic named Davies, assigned to Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion. Medical personnel, by all galactic convention, were non-combatants. Their role was clearly defined. Treat the wounded, maintain unit efficiency, avoid unnecessary risks that would compromise their medical capability. Davies had different ideas. The hologram showed him during a firefight near the Cambodian border. Enemy fire had pinned down 2 wounded soldiers in an exposed position. Standard protocol was clear: wait for suppressive fire, establish cover, then attempt evacuation. Davies looked at his wounded comrades, listened to their screams, and ran straight into the killing zone. 6 times. 6 times. Davies sprinted across open ground under active enemy fire, carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Each run defied probability, each rescue decreased his own survival chances exponentially. After the 6th evacuation, he had done more than duty required, more than any military doctrine demanded. Then he heard a 7th soldier crying for help. Zuextala watched in horrified fascination as Davies checked his medical supplies, nearly depleted, assessed the tactical situation, completely untenable, and calculated his survival probability, effectively 0. Any rational being would have recognized the futility. Davies grabbed his aid bag and ran into the fire one last time. Enemy bullets caught him 7 meters from the wounded soldier. He crawled the remaining distance, administered morphine, and died trying to drag Private Jackson to safety. Jackson survived. Why? Ziwextala whispered to the frozen hologram, her voice barely audible above the chamber's atmospheric processors. Computer, analyze Medic Davies' tactical decision matrix. Analysis, Medic Davies' actions violated 23 standard military protocols. Expected survival probability for 7th rescue attempt, 3.7%. Strategic value of target minimal. Recommended action, maintain position and await tactical support. Davies had known all of this. The data was clear, the mathematics irrefutable, the logic overwhelming. Save 6, lose 1 medic, maintain unit medical capability. Clean, efficient, rational. But Davies was human. Ziwextala found herself replaying the segment obsessively, watching this young human make the same impossible choice again and again. He couldn't save everyone, no medic could. But he had to try, because the alternative was listening to Jackson scream and doing nothing. The Vorthak had bred such inefficiency out of their species 12 centuries ago. Their military medics were programmed with strict triage protocols. Save those who could return to combat, maintain the greatest good for the greatest number, except that some casualties were simply inevitable costs of war. It was logical. It was efficient. It was civilized. So why did watching Davies die for one more soldier make her feel like her own species had lost something essential in their pursuit of perfection? The display continued, showing the broader conflict. A war that lasted over a decade, cost 58,000 American lives, and ended in strategic defeat. By every metric the Vorthak used to measure military success, Vietnam was a catastrophic failure of command, logistics, and political will. Yet she had just watched a medic die trying to save one more life. Perhaps, she said quietly, her scales rippling with an emotion she couldn't identify. We measure success differently than they do. The holographic timeline lurched forward, and Ziwextala found herself witnessing conflicts that seemed to exist in perpetual motion. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia. Wars that blurred together into an endless stream of asymmetric warfare where the very concept of victory became meaningless. Her analytical protocols, designed to process clean conflicts with defined objectives and measurable outcomes, struggled to categorize what she was seeing. Computer, define mission parameters for Operation Iraqi Freedom. Mission objectives, multiple and evolving. Primary stated goals include weapons of mass destruction elimination, regime change, democratization, counterterrorism, nation-building, regional stabilization. Ziwextala's scales rippled with confusion. Display mission parameters for Vorthak conquest of Rigel 7. Mission objectives, planetary subjugation. Timeframe, 72 hours. Success metrics, government surrender, resource extraction rights secured, civilian compliance achieved. Clean, simple, measurable. The human approach defied comprehension. She watched soldiers fighting enemies who wore no uniforms, followed no conventional tactics, and hid among populations that looked identical to them. The Vorthak solution would have been mathematically elegant. Eliminate all potential combatants, relocate surviving populations to controlled zones, establish administrative dominance through overwhelming force. But humans, she was beginning to understand, tied their own hands with something they called rules of engagement. A particularly disturbing segment showed an American patrol in Fallujah. Enemy fighters had taken positions in a school, using children as human shields while firing on coalition forces. The tactical solution was obvious: reduce the building to rubble with precision ordnance, eliminate the threat, accept minimal collateral damage as an operational necessity. Instead, she watched soldiers risk their lives in room-by-room clearing operations, checking every corner, every closet, every potential hiding spot to ensure no innocents were harmed. 3 Marines died in that school, killed by enemies who showed no such restraint. Tactically inefficient, Quindar observed, his bioluminescent patterns flickering with bewilderment. They sacrifice combat effectiveness to preserve enemy non-combatants. But Ziwextala was focusing on something else entirely. After the building was secured, she watched those same Marines sharing their field rations with the rescued children. the same children whose presence had made the operation so deadly. They cleaned the kids' wounds, treated their trauma, and called for medical evacuation despite knowing these children might grow up to hate them. The projection shifted to Afghanistan, where she witnessed something that challenged every principle of military logic she had ever learned. Human soldiers, after fighting Taliban insurgents all day, would spend their evenings building schools and medical clinics for the same communities that harbored their enemies. Computer, analyze strategic value of infrastructure development in active combat zones. Assessment, minimal immediate tactical value. Resource expenditure decreases combat readiness. Risk exposure increases casualty probability. Yet there they were, American engineers working alongside Afghan civilians to dig wells, install power generators, establish communications networks. The mathematical insanity was staggering. They were literally empowering populations that included their enemies, giving them resources that could be turned against coalition forces. A specific incident made her pause the recording entirely. Sergeant Rodriguez, a combat engineer, was building a playground in a Kandahar neighborhood when an IED exploded nearby, killing 2 of his squad mates. The logical response would be to abandon the project, categorize the area as hostile, and focus on force protection. Rodriguez returned the next day and finished the playground. Why? Ziwaxtala asked the hologram, her voice carrying genuine anguish. Your friends died. The population clearly contains hostile elements. Standard doctrine demands tactical withdrawal. But she was beginning to understand the answer, because Rodriguez had seen children playing in the rubble where a playground should be. Because those children deserved better, regardless of what their parents might think about foreign soldiers. Because humans apparently fought not just against their enemies, but for something larger than military objectives. The Forever Wars showed her conflicts without clear victories, battles won and lost simultaneously, enemies who became allies and allies who became enemies. It was chaos incarnate, a violation of every principle of efficient warfare. Yet embedded within this chaos was something that made her chest cavity ache with an emotion she couldn't name. These humans were trying to wage war while preserving their own humanity. They fought with one hand tied behind their backs because the alternative was becoming something they couldn't live with. Computer, she whispered. Display Vorthack protocols for occupied territory management. Standard procedure, eliminate resistance leadership, establish administrative control, implement resource extraction quotas, maintain order through superior force. Efficient, logical, effective, and suddenly, Ziwaxtala realized that efficiency wasn't the only measure of strength. Perhaps losing some battles to preserve your soul was its own kind of victory. The humans were fighting wars they couldn't win in ways that made winning impossible, and somehow that made them stronger than any perfectly efficient military machine. She was beginning to understand why her professors had assigned this analysis. These humans were dangerous in ways the Vorthack had never considered. The final data packets materialized before Ziwaxtala with an ominous weight that made her environmental sensors recalibrate automatically. What she witnessed in those files would haunt her for the rest of her existence, not because of the weapons themselves, but because of how humans chose to use them or, more terrifyingly, chose not to. Her golden eyes widened as the specifications scrolled past. Nuclear arsenals capable of sterilizing entire planetary surfaces, biological weapons that could target specific genetic markers and eliminate entire species within standard months, chemical agents that made the crude poison gas of their first war look like atmospheric freshener. Computer, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Calculate destructive potential of current human nuclear arsenal. Assessment, 13,400 nuclear warheads with total yield equivalent to 6,185 megatons of conventional explosive, sufficient to render Earth uninhabitable and eliminate 99.7% of human population within 72 hours. Quindar's bioluminescent patterns stuttered in shock. They possess world-ending capabilities? But their earlier conflicts showed primitive chemical propulsion, crude metallurgy. Display timeline for nuclear weapons development. Ziwaxtala commanded. The hologram revealed the timeline. From first nuclear detonation in 1945 to hydrogen bombs capable of destroying cities in the 1950s. By the 1960s, humans possessed enough nuclear weapons to end their own civilization multiple times over. But here was the part that made her scales freeze with terror. They had possessed these weapons during every conflict she had just witnessed. Computer, cross-reference nuclear weapons availability with Vietnam War timeline. Nuclear weapons available to United States during Vietnam conflict, 31,255 warheads. Usage in Vietnam, 0 weapons deployed. The mathematical impossibility of it struck her like a physical blow. The humans could have ended Vietnam in hours, could have turned the entire jungle into glass, eliminated every enemy, achieved total victory with minimal American casualties. Instead, they fought with conventional weapons for over a decade, losing 58,000 of their own people in a conflict they could have ended instantly. Afghanistan conflict analysis, she demanded. Nuclear weapons available during Afghanistan conflict, 5,113 warheads. Usage, 0 weapons deployed. Iraq, Syria, Somalia. Every asymmetric conflict where human soldiers died in ambushes, where roadside bombs claimed American lives, where enemy fighters used human shields and guerrilla tactics, in every single case, humans possessed the capability to end the conflict with overwhelming, world-destroying force. And in every single case, they chose not to. The final file was the most disturbing of all. She watched footage from a NATO engagement in Syria, where human soldiers approached a minefield to rescue enemy children who had wandered into the danger zone. The commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, received radio authorization to use tactical nuclear weapons against the nearby enemy position. Negative, Martinez replied. We don't do that to playgrounds. ZYX Thala's analytical mind reeled. The humans had developed weapons that made the Vorthack's most advanced plasma cannons look like training toys. They possessed biological weapons that could target enemy DNA while leaving their own species untouched. Chemical agents that could kill armies without damaging infrastructure. They had, quite literally, achieved the ability to become gods of war. And they locked these weapons away. Computer, display human nuclear weapons deployment since 1945. Nuclear weapons used in warfare. 2 weapons deployed against Japan, August 1945. Total deployment since 0 occasions. 78 years of possessing ultimate power. Dozens of conflicts where these weapons could have guaranteed victory. Millions of human casualties that could have been prevented with a single nuclear strike against enemy positions. And they chose to die rather than use them. The hologram showed her one final image. A human soldier in Afghanistan, walking through a minefield to rescue an enemy child. Each step could have been his last. Each step was a choice to value one small life over tactical advantage. The child was pulled to safety. The soldier stepped on a pressure plate on his way back. He died saving the daughter of a man who had been shooting at him an hour earlier. Computer, ZYX Thala said, her voice hollow. Calculate optimal Vorthack strategy for pacifying Earth. Recommended approach, orbital bombardment of major population centers, followed by systematic elimination of remaining military assets. Estimated time frame, 18 hours. Projected Vorthack casualties, minimal. She stared at the projection for a long moment, thinking of Davies running into gunfire to save one more soldier, of Rodriguez finishing a playground after his friends died, of Martinez refusing nuclear authorization to protect enemy children. Computer, she whispered. Recalculate based on observed human behavioral patterns. The computer processed for several seconds, an eternity in digital terms. Recalculation impossible. Human response patterns exceed logical parameters. No predictive model available. And in that moment, ZYX Thala realized the terrifying truth. The humans possessed the power to end worlds, but chose to save individual lives instead. They could have conquered their planet through overwhelming force, but chose to die for principles that made no tactical sense. They were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not because of their weapons, but because of their restraint. Quindar, she said quietly, we need to resign. The Admiral's office felt smaller than ZYX Thala remembered. Admiral Kethvar sat behind his command desk, a monument of polished obsidian that reflected the cold light of Vorthak Prime's twin suns. His ancient scales bore the ritual scars of 17 successful campaigns, each mark a testament to efficient conquest and tactical supremacy. He looked up from his tactical displays with the patient expression of a commander who had seen countless cadets request transfers or extended leave. What he hadn't expected was the formal resignation document already queued in his priority communications buffer. Cadet Zyxtala. His voice carried the authority of 6 centuries of military service. You wish to explain this unprecedented decision? Zyxtala stood at perfect attention. Her serpentine form coiled in regulation posture, but her scales had lost their lustrous sheen. The vibrant emerald coloration that once marked her as prime officer material had dulled to something approaching gray. Her golden eyes, once sharp with predatory confidence, now held depths of understanding that seemed far older than her 23 cycles. Sir, I have completed my comprehensive analysis of Species 7 Alpha human military capabilities and behavioral patterns. And your assessment? The Admiral's tone suggested routine curiosity rather than genuine interest. Another primitive species, another standard report. Sir, Zyxtala's voice carried a weight that made the Admiral's head crest rise slightly. We could conquer Earth in a single planetary rotation. Their weapons technology is centuries behind our smallest patrol vessels. Their defensive systems couldn't stop a Vorthak mining barge, much less a battle fleet. Their military forces are fragmented into hundreds of separate national entities with conflicting objectives and incompatible command structures. Admiral Kethvar nodded approvingly. This sounded like proper military analysis. Excellent assessment. Recommended invasion timeline. Sir, I cannot in good conscience provide tactical recommendations for the subjugation of humanity. The Admiral's predatory eyes narrowed. In 600 years of service, no cadet had ever refused to complete a strategic assessment. Explain your insubordination, Cadet. Zyxtala met his gaze without flinching. Because, sir, after observing their complete military history, I believe we could conquer their planet in a day, but we could never conquer humans in 1,000 years. That statement is logically inconsistent. Clarify. Sir, their strength isn't in their weapons systems or tactical doctrine. It's in something we systematically bred out of our species during the great efficiency reforms. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They fight for each other, Admiral. Not for territory acquisition or resource extraction or strategic positioning. For each other. She paused, remembering Davies running into gunfire one last time, Rodriguez finishing a playground after losing his squad, Martinez refusing nuclear authorization to protect enemy children. We are warriors, sir. The finest in the galaxy. We achieve victory through superior technology, overwhelming force projection, and tactical efficiency. Our military doctrine is mathematical perfection. Her scales rippled with something that might have been regret. But they are something we can never be again. They choose principles over survival, compassion over efficiency, hope over logic. Admiral Kethvar leaned forward, his command presence filling the room. You speak of sentiment, Cadet. Emotional weakness that clouds tactical judgment. No, sir. Zyxtala's voice gained strength. I speak of humans who possess nuclear weapons capable of ending their world, but walk through minefields to save enemy children instead of using them. I speak of medics who die trying to save one more soldier when they've already saved 6. I speak of engineers who build playgrounds in war zones after their friends are killed by the people they're trying to help. The Admiral was silent for a long moment, processing implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about military superiority. And if the High Command orders an invasion of Earth regardless of your assessment? Zyxtala's scales shimmered with something that might have been fear, but her voice remained steady. Then may whatever cosmic forces govern this universe have mercy on us, sir. Because the humans won't show us any mercy. Not because they're cruel or vindictive, but because they'll fight for their children and their wounded and their principles with everything they possess. She drew herself to full attention one final time. They'll fight us not because they can win, but because they cannot bear to lose what makes them human. And that, sir, makes them more dangerous than any weapon system we've ever encountered. Permission to be dismissed from military service, sir. Admiral Kethvar studied her for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he accessed his personal database and reviewed the preliminary reports from other cadets assigned to human military analysis. 7 resignations in the past 3 days. 14 requests for psychological evaluation. 3 applications for transfer to non-combat scientific research positions. Permission granted. Citizen ZYX Thala. As she turned to leave, Admiral Kethvar called out one final question. What will you do now? ZYX Thala paused at the doorway, her form silhouetted against the corridor's harsh light. I'm going to try to learn what it means to be worthy of the word human, sir. Even if I never can be one. After she left, Admiral Kethvar sat alone in his office for the first time in decades, actually questioning the righteousness of Vorthak expansion. With trembling claws, he activated the human military analysis files. The first holographic image materialized, human soldiers in muddy trenches, fighting for something the Vorthak military lexicon had no terminology for. By the time he finished reviewing the complete files, Admiral Kethvar understood why his cadets were resigning. He also understood why he was about to join them,